Rather than waste your times with a long introduction, let's just hop straight into the benchmarks. We're seeing the 4070 Ti versus the 4080 and the 4090. My 4070 Ti is the Asus TUF OC model, and we're looking at Fortnite because this game is incredibly demanding. If you want to see the current frame rates, up there, there's 3 FPS counters. The average throughout the benchmark run is in the middle. The instantaneous frame rate is on the left and the 1% lows are on the right. We also have a frame time graph. You can see the GPU's temperature, utilization, VRAM capacity. Allocation is the first one. The second memory number is the reported actual usage, CPU usage, all of that. And why are these struggling to run Fortnite, and why are we testing Fortnite in the first place? Because this is Unreal Engine 5, and this is the first game to feature Lumen, an amazing lighting system, and Nanite, which allows to reduce level of detail, pop, have things fade in smoothly, but we saw only the 4090 giving us about 60 FPS here, and it did have about a 65% lead over the 4070 Ti. So I tried adding in some upscaling here. Now, this has not been updated to feature DLSS yet, but it does have TSR, temporal super resolution, at the quality setting, so similar performance bump to what you'd get from DLSS quality. Here, leaving everything completely maxed out at the 4K epic settings, but using the upscaling, the 4070 Ti is close to a 60 FPS experience, falling a little bit short if you look at the averages. The 4080 is over 60 FPS, closing in on 70, and the 4090 currently is about an 86 FPS average, with the 4080 20% faster than the 4070 Ti and the 4090 51% faster. Now, I tried, what if we wanted to use native 4K without upscaling? Well, in that case, we have to reduce the settings. So I tried going down to the high preset and turning off the hardware accelerated ray tracing. To be clear, the Lumen lighting system is kind of a software ray traced lighting system is my understanding, but it can be hardware accelerated to improve the accuracy a little bit, but that does take a performance hit. With it turned off and down to the high settings, the 4070 Ti is still only a little over 50 FPS. The 4080 is now averaging over 60, and the 4090 is over 80 average, although all of them have 1% lows, well below 60. The 4090 with a 60% lead and the 4080 with a 20% lead over the 4070 Ti. So if we go to these same high settings with the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned off, and then kick in some upscaling, some temporal super resolution at the quality setting, we now see all of these GPUs can deliver a good, smooth experience. Even the 4070 Ti up in the mid 80 FPS range on average, at 4K on Unreal Engine 5. And to be clear here, I know Fortnite players aren't going to be using these settings most likely. This is really because this is the only game available to test out Unreal Engine 5, which is going to be used in a huge number of future AAA graphically demanding games. I'm just stuck with Fortnite being the only option to test right now. So I think based on those settings, we can see the 4070 Ti could be used at 4K with reduced settings, but if you use it as a 1440p GPU, can it max out Unreal Engine 5? Well, here we're looking at it maxed out, 1440p epic settings with the hardware accelerated ray tracing on, and we see us dipping a little below 60 FPS. The average is right about 59. I think if you were playing graphically demanding single-player games, a lot of people would be fine with this. I understand that's not what Fortnite is, but again, we're using Fortnite as a stand-in for Unreal Engine 5, Lumen, and Nanite performance, all of that. Here we're seeing the 4080 23% faster and the 4090 52% faster. If we turn the hardware-accelerated ray tracing off, we can see that it does reduce the GPU demand a bit, and the 4070 Ti is now averaging over 60 frames per second. The 4080 is just under 80 frames per second, and the 4090 is getting close to 100 frames per second. And so I really think the 4070 Ti is more at home here at 1440p when we're looking at these kind of future, extremely graphically demanding games. Again here, just getting a little over 60 FPS even with the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned off. So Unreal Engine 5, guys, it's going to be demanding. Now, if we go down to the high settings with the hardware ray tracing turned off at 1440p, we see the 4070 Ti now over 90 frames per second, the 4080 well over 100, and the 4090 over 130. Notice the 4090 is only leading by 44% now, but that's most likely hitting into some CPU limitations. The lumen lighting system is very demanding on the CPU, and so as we reduce the resolution and settings, the 4090 can be held back a little bit more by the CPU and RAM and isn't able to show off its full lead. Remember, at the maxed out 4K settings, the 4090 had a 65% lead over the 4070 Ti here. The 4080 is pretty consistently around a 20 to 25% lead, it seems here. By going down to 1080p completely maxed out, we're seeing the 4080 at a 19% lead and the 4090 at a 40% lead. And I'm not going to do a lot of 1080p testing in this video because I really think the 4070 Ti is more targeted at 1440p or above. But I did want to show how demanding Unreal Engine 5 can be, maxing out Lumen and nanite, the hardware ray tracing turned on, all of that. The 4070 Ti is doing good here. It's doing well. It's got 83 FPS average, but I mean, guys, it's not super high refresh rate for 1080p. But that's enough Unreal Engine 5. A Plague Tale Requiem is another really next-gen looking game. I actually think the character facial animations and all of that are actually the worst element of the game, which you're kind of seeing here visually. The scenery is stunning. The lighting's amazing. We're seeing the 4090 with a 65% lead over the 4070 Ti here, and the 4080 with a 26% lead over the 4070 Ti. But this is at 1440p Ultra. They're all delivering excellent frame rates. Other areas of the game can be more demanding than this one, but the 4070 Ti giving us 80 FPS here, so, dropping into the 70s, but I think we'd be well over 60 FPS, and this is a single-player game, fairly slow pace, so I think it's doing an excellent job at 1440p. And this game is really designed to, it's not cross-gen. I think we're going to see more demanding games like this as they're not supporting cross-gen on the consoles. This is PS5 and Xbox Series consoles only. Now, going up to the 4K Ultra settings, we see the 4090 stretch its advantage even further, showing us a 72% lead over the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 with a 28% lead. Notice that the 4070 Ti and the 4080 are below 60 FPS in this scene. The 4070 Ti pretty significantly below 60 FPS, and this is not even the most demanding scene in the game. So once again, it looks like at 4K, we're going to have to reduce the settings. Here I chose to do that by using DLSS at its quality setting. So this renders the game at a native 1440p image and uses the DLSS upscaling algorithm to try to produce a 4K-like output image. And now the 4070 Ti is over 60 FPS in this scene. Like I said, there are more demanding scenes, but I think you could very much play this game at these settings, and I do think DLSS looks quite good in this game. However, this, as I believe an NVIDIA-sponsored title, is one of the first games to feature frame generation, sometimes called DLSS 3, which you can use with normal DLSS either on or off. Here I chose to leave DLSS quality on and turn on frame generation. This boosts frame rates dramatically, but it has some impact to image quality and input latency, so I wouldn't compare these to, equivalent frame rates without frame gen turned on. I really direct you to my other video specifically talking about DLSS 3, because this can be a little bit confusing because not all frames are created equal. Let's just put it that way. I do think it's a good feature though. Now, in Cyberpunk 2077, this is a very demanding game, although it came out about 2 years ago. And at 1440p Ultra settings, all of these GPUs are delivering a pretty high refresh rate experience. For me, in single-player, first-person shooter type games, as long as I can be over 90 FPS, I usually feel pretty good about the smoothness, and anything above that is just kind of a bonus. We can see the 4070 Ti is delivering that. We're even seeing the 1% lows right now at about 87, with the average well over 100. The 4080 pushing 130 frames per second. The 4090 would be really at home on a 165 hertz 1440p monitor, and you can see the GPU utilization dipping on the 4090, especially as we go through this city area here, which shows that the CPU and RAM are actually holding it back a little bit here, and it could have had an even bigger lead. We're seeing it 53% faster than the 4070 Ti here, and the 4080 at 21% faster, but again, we did see some CPU limitation, especially on the 4090. By kicking on the ray tracing to its maximum settings, we can now see the 4090 stretching its lead to 74% faster than the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 to 24% faster. Now, with these maxed out ray tracing settings, we can see that the 4070 Ti at the native 1440p resolution is not going to be able to just max out any game if you're talking ray tracing and hold over 60 frames per second. You could play the game at these settings, but I think a lot of people would prefer to either turn down the ray tracing or to use upscaling. We can see below 50 FPS a lot of the time on the 4070 Ti. The 4080 does dip below 60 frames per second, but its average comes out a lot closer to 60. And the 4090 is actually the only GPU here that is able to deliver ray-traced Ultra 1440p at frame rates that I think most people would be happy with without upscaling. Although the 4080 is very playable here. This is a single-player title, so I think you could very much go for that. Go for those settings. Now, if you do upscale, so here we're just using DLSS quality, now the 4070 Ti is delivering a very, very good performance here. The 4080 is actually going closer to 100 frames per second, and the 4090, if you again look at its GPU usage percentage, is actually unable to even fully utilize here because ray tracing adds load to the CPU as well as to the GPU. So we can see that the 4090 is actually getting CPU limited here, which is why it's only showing a 35% lead over the 4070 Ti. Now it's giving us like 120 frames per second or so average with the 1% lows over 100, so it's certainly doing what you need it to do here. But realize that just that if you're using a 4090 at 1440p, even on a high-end CPU, especially when you add in ray tracing, a lot of times you can end up CPU limited. Now, DLSS 3 frame generation is an interesting option in CPU limited situations, but I'm using the public release version of Cyberpunk, which does not have DLSS 3 frame generation in it, because I think that's fair since the frame generation update is not available to the public, and you're the public looking to buy the GPU. Anyway, let's jump up to 4K. If we go to 4K Ultra settings, and we don't even have ray tracing enabled here, now we see the 4090 able to show off its 72% lead over the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 a 28% lead over the 4070 Ti. And the 4070 Ti is not able to deliver us a 60 frames per second in the more demanding areas here. The 4080 does dip below 60 frames per second, but is more frequently above it, as shown by the average. And the 4090 is the only GPU where I think, you'd really be very happy to just go 4K Ultra, don't turn anything down, and you're fine with even the 1% lows at 70 right now and the average at 83. So it's looking like, once again, the 4070 Ti is not a max out 4K and forget it kind of GPU with a 50 FPS average here. Now that doesn't mean that you can't play at good 4K settings with high refresh rates. If we turn down to the high settings and we enable DLSS quality, so it's not a native 4K, but you're using DLSS to output a 4K-like image with a significant boost to performance, we're now seeing the 4070 Ti well over 80 FPS, even the 1% lows well over 70 FPS. The 4080 with the 1% lows almost up to 100, with the average over 110, and the 4090 with the 1% lows at 120, average around 150. And I think as we go through the city section here, we might even see a little bit of a CPU limit on the 4090, showing a 63% lead over the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 showing a 26% lead over the 4070 Ti. So all of these GPUs certainly can give you a very good 4K high refresh rate experience. You just have to be willing to tweak the settings to get there, especially on cards like the 4070 Ti. Now, remember, we had not even enabled ray tracing here. If we try to max out the ray tracing, which you certainly don't need to do, but if we max it out to the RT Ultra preset, which by the way isn't even actually the maximum because you could turn the lighting all the way up to Psycho, we now see the 4070 Ti and the 4080 delivering what, in my opinion, would be unplayable frame rates. The 4090 is also not doing very well here. You could play it at these settings, but I don't think it makes a lot of sense, delivering a 40 FPS-ish average right now. And I did notice the VRAM utilization here was interesting, because I think some people are wondering, is 12 gigabytes enough on the 4070 Ti? If you look at the RAM and memory usage here, I think the 4080 and the 4090 are actually using around 12, allocating around 13, and the 4070 Ti is only able to use about 10. And notice the blue, the actual system RAM, is higher than the 4080 and the 4090. So I think we're actually seeing some spillover into system RAM here, which I think explains the 91% lead by the 4090 in this situation. However, you wouldn't be playing at these settings anyway, so I don't think that VRAM limitation actually really mattered. It just explained why the 4090 had an over 90% lead. Now, I was thinking, okay, if we wanted to play with RT Ultra, how much would we need to upscale? I had to go all the way down to DLSS performance mode in order to get the 4070 Ti up to around 60 frames per second at 4K RT Ultra. That means that this is actually rendering the game at 1080p and then using the DLSS algorithm to upscale and try to output a 4K-like image. Although, personally, I find using DLSS performance a little bit too much. I find a little bit too much breakup in the image. I'd probably turn down the ray tracing settings rather than go to DLSS performance, but maybe you're less picky about those image elements than I am. At these settings, the 4080 is delivering around 80 FPS, and the 4090 is averaging over 100 FPS and even becomes somewhat CPU limited in certain scenes. And the 4090 is 62% faster than the 4070 Ti here, but probably would have had an even larger advantage, like I said, without any CPU limitation. Let's move on to another game. How about playing some Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2? This is the same engine used in Warzone 2 as well. And right now we're looking at it completely maxed out at 4K extreme settings. Now, I understand that as a competitive game, most people would play at lower settings and resolutions, and we'll look at that for sure, but I wanted to start out by showing if we push the graphics demand as far as we can, like how does it do? Well, the 4070 Ti is delivering a pretty good experience here at 4K Extreme. If you're not thinking about it as needing, like, you know, competitive frame rates, it's certainly doing fine. The 4080 is averaging over 100, and the 4090 well over 100, although we saw the dips go well below that, and the 4090 with a 62% lead over the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 with a 22% lead over the 4070 Ti. And I'll show this little scene here so you can see those benchmark results real quickly if you want to pause there for a second. But I think a more realistic resolution and setting for this game competitively would be 1440p at the balanced settings. And at these settings, the 4070 Ti is, once you're actually in the gameplay here, delivering you around 200 frames per second. It goes above and below. The 4080, well over 200 FPS most of the time, and the 4090 more into that 250 to 300 FPS range a lot of the time. Now, the 4090 is only showing a 35% lead over the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 only showing a 14% lead over the 4070 Ti. And that is probably, once again, at 1440p and reducing graphics settings, it's hard for the 4090 to get fully utilized even on a high-end CPU. And that's what we're seeing here. That's why that gap is so small. It's just, you know, reduced settings at 1440p. The 4090 gets bottlenecked a bit by the CPU. Now, let's jump over to the Callisto protocol. This is an Unreal Engine 4 game, and this is one of the most recent ones and probably the best looking one that's been released. It pushes the graphics pretty far. It also seems to be a bit unoptimized. And I thought it was interesting that the 4090 is actually showing an 81% lead over the 4070 Ti here. Although the 4070 Ti at 4K Ultra is averaging around 60 frames per second, all of these GPUs have 1% low dips, and I think that's just this game. This game has some scenes that are just very unoptimized, in my opinion. But either way, we can see an interesting spread in the GPU performance here. Now, if I turn on ray tracing to the maximum settings, The 4090 actually decreases its lead to 55%, but you can see it doesn't fully utilize at times, like going through this hallway. I've noticed that enabling ray tracing in this game increases the CPU load massively, but only on a kind of a few threads, so it doesn't take full advantage of the multi-threading of the CPU. And with that in mind, you become CPU limited on the more powerful GPUs, especially at lower resolutions. At 4K here, it's less so. So the ray tracing in this game, I really wish they'd do something about how it's utilized on the CPU. Because, anyway, we'll see it again as we go down to 1440p. But at 1440p ultra settings, all of the GPUs are doing well, although the 1% lows, again, there still are these difficult areas that dip, and the frame time graphs look very stuttery here. The 4090 showing a 44% lead over the 4070 Ti. Again, at 1440p, we can see the GPU utilization on the 4090 is usually held back by the CPU. It's delivering excellent frame rates. It's just, the 4090 is really too strong for 1440p in a lot of cases, and CPUs have trouble keeping up. And the 4080 showing an 18% lead, but all of them are showing at least average frame rates well over 100 frames per second at 1440p Ultra. If we turn the ray tracing on to the maximum, this will show off what I meant about the CPU limitations in this game when you enable the ray tracing. This is explaining why the 4090 is only showing a 13% lead over the 4070 Ti here, and the 4080 only shows a 9% lead. If you look at the GPU utilization percentage on all three of them, honestly, but especially the 4080 and the 4090, they are frequently way below 100% utilization, again indicating that we're being bottlenecked by the CPU. And you're like, but the CPU is only reporting like 20% usage. Again, that's because the game, I think it's too single-threaded on its ray tracing calculations. And yes, ray tracing is calculated both on the CPU and the GPU. Let's hop into another game. Here we're looking at Forza Horizon 5, and even at the 4K extreme settings, once again, the 4090 is so powerful that we're not seeing it reach 100% utilization, which is reducing its lead down to 42%. It would be capable of more. The 4080 is showing a 19% lead over the 4070 Ti. And I think the important thing here is that all three GPUs are delivering an average of over 100 frames per second at 4K extreme settings. Now, this game has been updated to where you could turn the ray traced settings up past this to actually enable ray traced reflections while you're racing, and that's not part of the 4K extreme setting. So you could use that extra GPU headroom and turn things up further. I wanted to look at a DX11 game before we're done here, and God of War is a DX11 game. Wanted to see if anything weird happened here. We're looking at the 4K Ultra settings here, and the 4090 has a 74% lead. It's reporting 100% utilization most of the time here, so really able to stretch its legs. The 4080 has a 27% lead over the 4070 Ti. And all three GPUs are doing very well. Now, I use the opening cinematic, which is pretty easy to run. When Kratos is actually here in this scene, frame rates are a bit lower than the averages, and this is more typical of the actual gameplay frame rates. But the 4070 Ti is well over 70 frames per second, even during actual gameplay, as we're testing out here. So I didn't see the need to go down to 1440p. Again, looking at kind of games that are a little bit older, originated on the PS4, Horizon Zero Dawn, at its 4K ultimate setting, has the 4090 71% faster than the 4070 Ti, and the 4080 29% faster. And we're seeing all of them, including the 4070 Ti, delivering very good performance, averaging over 90 FPS here for the 4070 Ti, even at the 4K ultimate settings. So once again, I'm not going to test this one out at 1440p because that's most likely to just introduce CPU limitations, and they can all handle 4K ultimate well, so I don't really see the point in reducing these settings. I did also want to check out a Vulkan game. So this is Red Dead Redemption 2 using Vulkan to render. You could also use DX12, but I wanted specifically to test out Vulkan. You'll notice I don't have my frame rate averages or 1% lows here, so I'm just going to go off the average at the end of the benchmark run. That's because this benchmark has multiple loading screens throughout it, and I didn't want my averages to get thrown off by the loading screen and all of that. So I'm just going to use the numbers that the benchmark itself spits out at the end. But all of the GPUs are doing well with the favor quality max preset slider just slid all the way to the right. The 4070 Ti is well over 70 frames per second, running through the city on horseback, in combat, all of that. With the 4080 closer to 100 frames per second, the 4090 at 130 frames per second. Here's the overall averages, and we see the final results. Now that we've established the performance in tons of games, Unreal Engine 5, the new graphically demanding stuff, ray tracing on, ray tracing off, all of that, I think we can start talking about value. So really, there's the quality of the GPU and then there's what it costs. Now, this is what I was given pricing-wise in time for my review. These are Asus models because I specifically in this review was showing you the TUF RTX 4070 Ti, the overclocked model. So it has a small factory overclock, and I did leave that on while testing it. So this is the out-of-the-box settings. And it comes in at an $850 MSRP. And then there's always the big question of, will you actually be able to get it at MSRP? And the actual base model of the TUF version, 4070 Ti without the factory overclock, should be the one that retails at the official MSRP of $800 for these GPUs. So yes, the rumors were true. It is an $800 MSRP. But again, I think there's going to be a big question on how many of those models are actually available after the first day when the $800 models dry up. And then there's the ROG Strix models. We have the Strix with $950, or if you want a factory overclock on that, you can pay another $100 and go up to $1,050. And again, these are the MSRPs I was given from Asus. So we'll see what, other, AIB partner brands are charging. To my knowledge, there is no Founders Edition, but that, board partners have been asked to at least provide one model at the $800 MSRP. So where does that put us from a value proposition? Well, let's actually hop over to my trusty old calculator and look at a couple of things. So one thing we saw is throughout these benchmarks, the performance deltas between the cards vary game by game, but I think that the 4080 was, I think calling it 25% faster based on the testing I did is a pretty good kind of average of the results. We saw it sometimes as low as 20% faster and sometimes as high as almost 30% faster. And I think more typically in the mid 20% faster range. Now, the 4090, while it frequently did not show a 70% lead, I think that that's often when it was held back a bit by the platform, especially when we were looking at 1440p, things like that. So when it was really able to fully stretch its potential, we often saw it 70% or more faster. Sometimes not, but I think I'm going to call a 1.7 times faster on the 4090. And here's how I'm going to look at my value comparison. If you take the baseline price of $800 for the cheapest 4070 Ti, and then you multiply that by 1.25, you would get 1,000. Now, what does that mean? If we're looking at price to performance versus the 4080, this means that the 4080 would have to cost $1,000 in order to give you the same price to performance ratio as an $800 4070 Ti. Now, the MSRP of the 4080 is $1,200. If I'm looking at PC Part Picker right now, which I am here live, this is just what I'm showing when I sort prices low to high. It shows some models available at $1,200. Most of them are available at a little bit more than that, but $1,200-ish. And we've seen that these have had trouble selling out at those prices, and a lot of people have said that $1,200 is overpriced for the 4080, myself included. So basically, this is delivering better price to performance than a 4080. A 4080 would have to drop to $1,000 to deliver about the same price to performance as the 4070 Ti. Now the 4090, if we do 800 times a 1.7 times performance uplift, that gets us to 1,360. That means a 4090 would have to cost a little under $1,400 to give you the same price to performance as the 4070 Ti at $800. Now the 4090, if we search for them, this Asus model is not actually in stock. You can just do like a notify me. And so the ones that are actually in stock are over $2,000. And again, the MSRP is at $1,600. So even compared to the MSRP, which you can't find the 4090 for, the $800 baseline price is better price to performance. So basically the 4070 Ti, if it's actually available, and I'm going to say that, if it's actually available at its $800 baseline, does deliver better price to performance than the rest of the lineup. Now, if these $800 ones are just shipped in limited quantities, and then the rest are shipped at these higher price points, should you still try to go out and buy those? Well, we can adjust our calculations here a little bit. So if I change this to 850, so now we're looking at the actual value proposition of the model I actually tested in this video, which does have the $850 MSRP. Well, that's still showing us better price to performance than the 4080 and the 4090. The 4080 would have to come down to 1,060, and the 4090 would have to come down to 1,450 to give you a similar price to performance as an $850 RTX 4070 Ti. Now, if you're going up to the ROG Strix model at $950, does that make any sense? Well, the $950 price point is actually coming in at about the same price to performance as the MSRPs on the 4080 and the 4090, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then if you buy the factory overclocked model, which is here at 1,050, and sure, maybe you get a few percent more performance, but it's not going to be dramatically different, guys. The cooler models don't make a huge difference unless you're actually thermal throttling. Anyway, whatever. So here we're seeing that this one actually offers worse price to performance than the MSRPs of the 4080 and the 4090. Now, a lot of you guys would probably like me to now compare this to AMD's offering with the 7900 XT and the 7900 XTX, and as well as compare this to previous generations of NVIDIA GPUs. Now, the thing is, in my style of head-to-head comparisons where I show all of the graphics cards, it's not set up well for doing more than 2 or 3, maybe 4 graphics cards in the same video. So basically, stay tuned to the channel. I've already edited together all of the footage for a comparison with my 3080 and my 7900 XT, which are the closest price competitors from the 3000 series from NVIDIA and from the 7000 series from AMD. So stay tuned for that video, and we'll dive into whether how the value stacks up against those, as well as the performance and all of that. Now, the other thing I should mention when we're talking about value is there is the just frames per dollar. I'm going to back this calculation down to the 850 mark, because that's the actual one I reviewed in this video. So there is the performance per dollar. But then there's the other stuff that the new generation does add in. You do have the AV1 encoding. You do have better power efficiency than the 3000 series if you're comparing it to that. And then there's also the DLSS frame generation. I'd encourage you guys to watch my full video on my thoughts on that. I think it's overall a good feature that you'd use in certain games, mostly single-player games, especially if they're kind of slow-paced, that kind of a thing. And it really helps out in CPU-limited situations. So I think there's definitely further value adds from the 4000 series compared to the 3000 series overall. Now, as far as the 4070 Ti itself just as a product, I think if you're wanting to play the most demanding new games, I think it looks like it's best targeted at 1440p. We saw maxing out Unreal Engine 5 at 1440p was already a stretch just to get to 60 frames per second. And I imagine that future Unreal Engine 5 games might have be shooting for more advanced and more demanding graphics than Fortnite does, right? And we're already seeing 60 FPS trying to max out Fortnite, maybe a little bit below. At 4K, it certainly does well, and it's faster than something like a 3080. It's approaching the speeds of like a 3090, 3090 Ti even. But that does mean that you're generally having to reduce settings in the more demanding games, especially these new games like Plague Tale Requiem, like I said, Fortnite with Unreal Engine 5. So I think you could buy a 4070 Ti for 4K, but you're gonna wanna plan on reducing settings and or upscaling using DLSS. If you're wanting to play at high refresh rate 4K, you'd probably hope that games enable like frame generation, so like tweak your settings to 60 FPS. Hope there's maybe frame generation to get to that 120 if you're on the 120 hertz, 4K monitor, that kind of a thing. I think those would be realistic expectations. And again, not every game is going to support frame generation, especially at first, that kind of stuff. And like I said, watch my video on that to look at the latency cost and the image quality cost of using it, that kind of a thing. Although overall, I did like it in most games I tried it in. Then but like I said, at 1440p, I think the 4070 Ti is much more at home, and that would be the resolution I think might make the most sense for the purchase if you're wanting to max out graphic settings and not have to turn things down. Anyway, this video is getting pretty long, and like I said, I'm going to get further comparisons against other GPUs from the 3000 series, from AMD's GPUs, all of that. So stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in these in-depth head-to-head comparisons. And overall, I've got to say, it's at least nice to see the MSRPs delivering better value than the rest of the 4000 series. Although let's acknowledge the fact that seeing a 70 Ti class card priced at $800 to, well, over $1,000 on the AIB cards feels really bad. It feels really bad. And while this is offering better value than the 4080 MSRP, let's remember that the 4080 MSRP has been widely considered to be terrible. So again, it's nice to see some improvement in price to performance on the 4000 series with the 4070 Ti. But please don't take me as saying, I think this is fantastic. Normally, we would like to see this type of performance coming in at, well, a 70 Ti pricing last generation was $600. And keep in mind that the 3070 Ti was criticized for being overpriced at $600. So this is still feeling bad, but it's at least a little bit better than the performance we've seen on offer from the rest of the series so far. Anyway, see you guys in some future videos. I hope all of you have an excellent day.